Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now I apologise if it seems like I've gone a bit overboard with the Cyberpunk videos lately, but I promised to follow the progress of this game as various patches came out. Let's face it, this hasn't exactly been the most conventional game launch ever, and it's going to be continuously interesting to see how things either improve or get worse. I don't think that will be the case, and in fact the latest patch, as of the 20th of December 2020, brings with it a fantastic fix for those with dual-core processors, as long as those dual-core processors have 4 threads. So you may remember a couple of videos ago we tested Cyberpunk 2077 on the Athlon 3000G, and I found that the game wouldn't load any previous save games. This meant that we were either stuck on a black screen indefinitely, or we had to start a new game. Doing this was a fine temporary fix to at least start the game, but even then Cyberpunk would crash after a few minutes of play, and that isn't exactly the best way to experience this game. These were of course just my findings, but I noticed this on any 2-core chip that I tested. Now though, with patch 1.05, it seems like this issue has been resolved. Let's jump into the game and try and load a previous save, a task that was impossible with previous game versions and a 2-core CPU. I've blurred the save files to try and avoid spoiling any progress for you, just to avoid giving anything away. As we load up the game using nothing but the dual-core Athlon 3000G and the integrated Vega 3 graphics, you'll notice that, well, the game actually starts and resumes from our previous checkpoint, and it doesn't crash after a couple of minutes either. I'm running the game at low with 50% of 720p in order to achieve close to 30 FPS with this APU, and from what I've tested, the actual performance, so frame rate and frame times, don't differ from the previous 1.04 patch, at least not with this hardware. I'm using the same 16 gigs of 3200 MHz RAM, and the Vega 3 graphics are overclocked from 1100 to 1650 MHz, same as they were before. This can be done with a stock Ryzen cooler. I haven't tried it on the stock Athlon cooler. Just to make sure that this wasn't some sort of fluke or lucky occurrence, I loaded up another previous save game, and thankfully we were able to resume from yet another manual save. Autosaves of course can be loaded too, just to make that clear. Performance is hovering around 30 FPS still, and this can increase to 40 in less populated areas, sometimes even higher than that. Now this isn't ideal of course, as the game is a bit of a blur and at times a stuttery mess, but we are using a processor that can cost less than the game itself in some countries, so as far as I'm concerned this is doing a great job. Now I should say, just as I mentioned in the previous 3000G video, that this is a better case scenario. What I mean by that is that I'm using 3200 MHz dual channel RAM and 16 gigs of the stuff. If for example you have 8 gigs of 2400 MHz memory for example and a single stick of it, then you're probably going to get worse results. As always with an APU, I'd advise you to get the fastest RAM you can afford and as much of it as you can afford too. 2 sticks are also better than 1. Try and avoid single channel configurations if you can, unless you plan to add a second matching module to your build pretty soon. So on to the not so good news. Unfortunately, 2-core CPUs without SMT or hyperthreading will still not work. Again, you can start a new game with them, but based on my results, crashes will occur, and there's no point starting a new game that you can't carry on with. I tested Cyberpunk with the 3000G with SMT off, and I also tested it with the Celeron G5900 just to have a look at both a Intel and AMD option, and although one is a 2-core CPU with 4 threads and one is a natural 2-core chip, both of them refuse to load any of my previous saves, be it an auto or manual save game. In reality, I think that even if the game did load here, the stutters and frame dips would be quite unbearable anyway, so a 2-core CPU with 4 threads is probably the absolute minimum that I would have recommended anyway. Of course, this fix now means that you can build a super cheap PC using a 2-core chip like the 3000G and a discrete graphics card like the 1050 Ti if you want. But I wouldn't actually recommend this combination because performance is quite bad. With this combo we saw some pretty unstable frame times, and whether you're playing at 1080p or 720p it's not going to be much fun. This is likely in part due to the 1050 Ti as well, which struggles with Cyberpunk even when paired with a much better processor. It's still capable of much more than this, don't get me wrong, and I've seen a 1050 Ti paired with a Ryzen 3700 for example in some videos where you'll see more frames, but still there will be stutters present. So let's move on to another Intel CPU now. This is the dual-core G6400 Pentium that we're using, the first 4GHz Pentium ever to be released. I think the Pentium 4's never quite got to 4GHz. Now pairing a G6400 with my RTX 3070 would be quite a mismatch to say the least, so I've swapped that out for a GTX 1650 GDDR6 GPU, not to be confused with the Super version. Continuing, using the 16GB of DDR4 as well, but now we are clocked at 2666 MHz with that due to the limitation of the CPU and motherboard combo. There were a brief couple of moments where I thought the game wasn't going to load, but it seemed to work every time without fail. I was quite surprised to see close to 60 frames per second even at 1080p, but I soon realised that I was using a static resolution scaling option, so everything was actually rendered at about 60% of 1080p. I jumped into the settings to change this to 100%, and surprisingly this budget configuration still handled Cyberpunk with at least 30 frames per second. Here we are with a dual-core chip in 2020 running one of the most demanding games. Our average actually sat around the mid-40s with 1080p low, and this includes reduced crowd density as well, a setting that is still hidden away under the gameplay options. I hope CD Projekt Red consider moving this to the graphics menu, as it is easily missed and could have a detrimental effect on some hardware. So as of Cyberpunk 2077 update 1.05 on PC, it seems as though the game has become more hardware inclusive, with 2-core CPUs able to handle it just fine, providing that they have 4 threads, of course, and aren't completely ancient. I don't know how well it would run on something like an i3 530, I don't have one of those on hand at the moment, but I can imagine that it probably wouldn't be as smooth as the gameplay today, which in itself actually had a few stutter issues. I hope that this support though for dual-core chips will be continued in later updates, and I can't see why it wouldn't be. I have no doubt that in say a few months time this will be a completely different experience performance-wise too, not only on PC but the console versions as well. I'm looking forward to those future updates. Anyway, thank you for joining me on this patch analysis video. Thank you very much for 400,000 subscribers on the channel. Your constant support is just awesome, to be honest. For those of you who bought some of those bucket hats yesterday, or after finding the link in a previous video, thank you for purchasing those. There are more available now. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want one. They're all handmade by my sister, who gets to keep about a penny of every sale. No, she keeps pretty much all of the money from them, so I'll leave a link to the Etsy page where you can find those if you want one. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.